Hi class, this is the first video for chapter 6. So chapter 6 is kind of a bifurcated chapter in the sense that there is one part of the chapter that is really focused on deviance, and I will be doing two Camtasia videos geared towards that. This introductory video where I introduce you to terms associated with deviance, and then a second video presentation where we discuss kind of some explanations for deviance, particularly highlighting the the sociological functional perspective and sociological symbolic interactionist perspectives on why people are deviant. And then the second part of this chapter, which kind of correlates to the conflict perspective, is an introduction and a kind of sociological view on the criminal justice system. So there will be two Camtasia presentations that I will be posting that are related to that part of the chapter as well. So beginning with this first video, which is an introduction to deviance, let's start off by actually going over some terms that are related to deviance or the opposite of deviance. So just a reminder, all of this is in relation to the concept of social norms, and these are the standards of behavior, the expectations related to behavior that society has. And a lot of these standards and expectations are unwritten, but nevertheless, they guide the social behavior of members of a group. And that's because most of us go along with these standards of behavior due to conformity. And the basic definition of conformity is this is just a change in one's response in order to fit in. And this can be due to either real group pressure. So if you've ever done something to fit in with your peers, what we call peer pressure, or on the basis of peer pressure, then you know that group pressure can be real. Or it can just be implied in the sense that you think the group would feel a certain type of way or react a certain way to you if you did not go along and fit in. And conformity sounds like it can be a bad thing because we oftentimes talk about being your own person, following your own path, not going along with the crowd. But it's worth noting that if most of us did not follow the norms most of the time, what would be the result? It would be potentially chaos. It would be anarchy. So I don't want you to think that conformity is necessarily bad. But it's not always an inherent good either. I'm sure you can think of times either from your own life or from history where people pretty much following the crowd or going along with what the majority of society thinks or feels or expects of them can have, negative consequences as well. But the reason why we choose to conform is that because in most situations we are in fact concerned with the correct behavior. We want to do what's expected of us. We want to do the right thing. And then in general, in most group situations, we're pretty anxious to fit in. It does take a certain amount of bravery, or at the very least, a certain amount of, not giving a what to kind of stand out and to not fit in. And for most of us, most of the time, we oftentimes want to fit in with the larger crowd. We want to display the correct behavior. And so this is why we choose to conform, whether or not that group pressure is in fact real or if it's just in fact implied or exists in our heads. Now, I'm going to go back to a term from several slides ago. If the norms that we are trying to go along with, the norms that we're trying to uphold, if they have been codified into formal rules, policies, or laws, and therefore we are going along with them, not just because we want to fit in, but because, we also want to avoid penalty, this is more of an example of compliance. And so when you are on Gaston College's campus, if you are going along with like the student code of conduct, that is compliance. If you know that you have a uniform you have to wear to work and you show up to work and you wear that uniform, that's not so much conformity, like I want to look like my fellow coworkers, more so than it's compliance, that there is this formal norm, right? It's been codified in some way into a law, into a policy, and you're going along with that. Which means that who has the ability to kind of create these formal norms? And this brings up a concept that we've kind of talked around, but have not necessarily defined, and that's authority. And that is the ability of an actor to issue orders to others. So basically, this actor, this individual, this institution can direct, regulate, and evaluate the behavior of others because they have rights that are vested in that position. So, if your friend says, you know what, ball caps aren't cool and I don't wear them anymore, and you go along with that friend, that's conformity, because really your friend doesn't have an authority to issue orders to you, right? The position of friend doesn't come with rights that say I get to regulate what my other friends wear. However, if you have a school teacher that has a rule, that there are no ball caps to be worn in their classroom, then whether you agree or not, the expectation is that you are going to comply with that policy because that individual, that teacher, has authority, and they have authority because of their position of teacher, right? So you can think of who else in your life, has authority. Your parents, especially if you're still a dependent. If you have a job, your manager or your boss or the owner of the company all have authority over you. In a school setting, it might be everything from your teachers to your administrators. If you play on a sports team, your coach, if you're in a club, if your club has like a faculty advisor, then that advisor, right? All of those are positions of authority, and those positions come with certain kind of built-in rights to kind of regulate behavior of people, at least within that context. And part of that behavior regulation comes with establishing policies and rules that you expect people to follow. You expect them to comply. So normally students are really clear about the difference between conformity and compliance. It's when we add a third term that it can get kind of confusing. And that third term is obedience. And so if you look at that definition of obedience, a behavioral response to a direct request from an authority, the key word here is direct request, right? So if going back to the teacher and ball cap example, if the teacher has the policy that there is no, and it's a known policy, right? There are no ball caps in his or her classroom, and students follow that, then that's compliance. But let's say that the teacher does not necessarily have that as a policy, like it's not written down anywhere. And so you show up one day and you have on, we won't even say a ball cap. We'll say that it's cold outside, so you have on a ski cap, and the teacher is like, I'm sorry, you need to take that off. Then if you take off your cap, it is because of the direct request from that authority figure, and we call that obedience, right? So an authority figure can ask you to do something even if it isn't an established formal norm, and if you do it, you are displaying obedience and not necessarily compliance. In the sense that you are responding to a direct request, not necessarily just a kind of known formal norm. So when we think of obedience, a very kind of significant experiment was done in order to kind of understand why people obey authority, or to what extent will people obey authority. And that is Stanley Milgram's obedience research. And you see here on the slide, this is actually a flyer for one of his iterations of that experiment, you could see how it was advertised as a study of memory, and that you would get paid for 1 hour of your time. And so, before we discuss the experiment in more detail, which I hope at this point you also would have watched the YouTube video that you see the link there for, so that this is more of just a reminder of what you've already watched and you're not necessarily hearing about it for the first time. But Stanley Milgram was an adolescent during the aftermath of World War II. And so, like a lot of people, the whole world was kind of looking at Germany in particular, like, how did a country full of good, decent people, Germans, like, they were no different than any other country. Their people did not seem to be like horrible monsters. How did they largely support the rise of Hitler and the things that happened under the Nazi regime, particularly the Holocaust? People were like, why did this happen? And so, if you've watched the video, then you know that when the Nuremberg trials happened and we were trying to learn more about why people participated, with this regime and in the Holocaust, one of the kind of military leaders was like, I was just following orders. And that idea that people can just follow orders and potentially do, some pretty chilling things, a lot of people found that very, very disturbing. But Milgram, in particular, wanted to study it. And so, in order to study it, he created perhaps what it was one of the most controversial social psychology studies ever done. And so, he wanted to know how people could become contributors to something horrible, awful, evil, like mass murder. So he came up with this experimental paradigm to see what harmful things a person would do if they just think that they were obeying an authority figure. And so, how this experiment was set up is that you have the teacher, you have the learner, and you have the experimenter. So the participant, the person that responds to the ad, is called the teacher. And they're told that they are taking place in an experiment to test memory, and that the learner, who is a Confederate, meaning that they know what's going on in the experiment. They're really just an actor, playing a part in order to help determine how the teacher, the volunteer participant, would respond. So they're told that they're helping the learner, learn these word pairs. And if they got an answer wrong, then they were instructed by the experimenter, who also, of course, was part of the experiment, so knows what's really going on. They would be instructed by the experimenter to elicit a small, to give a small shock to the learner when they got something wrong. And the shock level would gradually increase when the learner made a mistake. And of course, the learner isn't really getting shocked, right? This is all an act, but you, the teacher, don't know that, because you are sitting in front of this fake machine and you've been told that, it's hooked up to the learner. And in the original experiment, as you can kind of see in the diagram, the learner is on the other side of the wall, so you can't really even see them. And so the whole point of the study was to see how far along people would go in terms of administering the shock, and whether or not they would administer all the way up to kind of the full maximum, even though at that point the learner would have started crying out and asking to stop. And the experimenter's job there was to provide that kind of direct request or direct demand that the teacher keep going. So that's how we get to the obedience part, right? That the teacher is basically or the experimenter is basically telling you, the teacher, to keep administering this shock. And so they wanted to know, to what extent do people obey? And so the results of that first iteration of the experiment, which he later repeated it several times, and and the results kind of varied depended on how certain factors were tweaked, but it was that about 65% of people administered the full shock. And it's worth noting that everyone 100% administered up to what they call an intense shock, 300 volts. It was only once they kind of hit that point that even some people started to stop with that level. But over 65%, so close to two-thirds of people administered the full shock. And so, that seemed to suggest that justification that people give about obedience, that they're just, following orders, it was supported that when an authority figure makes a direct request, people are more likely to obey than to not obey, even when it is in case something that is truly awful. Now, of course, this type of experiment could not be done today for all types of ethical reasons, and that's part of what makes Milgram's study, very controversial. But the kind of results of that and what his experiment just suggests about people's willingness to obey is why we still teach the experiment, or why this experiment is still so very significant. Now, that being said, all of this leads up to our discussion of deviance, because we do not always obey, we do not always conform, and we do not always comply. So a fancy way of that is saying is, we don't always do what's expected of us. And that is basically what deviance is. It's any attitude, behavior, or condition that violates cultural norms or societal laws, and it results in disapproval, hostility, it's sanction if it becomes known. So, they take a moment and write down some deviant behaviors. What are some things that go against societal expectations? This could be everything from walking around barefoot in public places, because this is something that we don't expect to see. It could be things related to dress code, or not dress code, but just expectations, norms around dress, right? Everything from, at least in our society, there's often a certain amount of negative sanctions response when men wear dresses or skirts, or there used to be this type of response, when women wore pants, but now, of course, that's become much more normative. How would you respond if saw an adult walking around in just diapers? That's acceptable for little children, but at some point, we expect people to have on full clothes. We have norms related to public behavior, from standing in lines to, going the right way up the escalator, facing out on an elevator. So if you did behavior that violated any of those expectations, this would be deviant. Now, who determines what is deviant in society? For the most part, this is kind of larger dominant society. And this goes back to that culture chapter where we talked about, the challenges of living in a multicultural society. What your book called like culture wars, or, culture clashes. Is that, sometimes a subculture might hold up a behavior or value as being normative, but dominant culture feels very differently against it. And so you might be seen as deviant by dominant culture for doing something that, you were taught or raised to believe was in fact not deviant. But yes, for the most part in society, it is the dominant culture that gets to establish what is and is not deviant. And it's certainly dominant culture that then usually gets to codifies some of these expectations into formal norms, policies, and laws. And so Durkheim, who wrote about deviance, who's one of the first functionalists to write about deviance, made the point that deviance certain amount is functional for society. It helps us clarify moral boundaries. It helps us affirm norms. Like, this is why we do the right thing, right? When we see people who are doing the wrong thing, it helps all the rest of us kind of coalesce around the right way of doing something. So, in this sense, it can encourage social unity, and it also can sometimes promote social change because sometimes, as a deviant behavior becomes more and more accepted, sometimes it leads larger society to question, well, why aren't we doing this? So think about this is where sometimes protests, gain power, whether you're talking about the civil rights movement or the women's movement, that sometimes people can, by virtue of being deviant, point out kind of the unfairness or the injustice of a norm, and society will change. So a little bit of deviance is to be expected in society. We'll talk in the next presentation about kind of our concerns when a little bit of deviance becomes too much deviance, because Durkheim had a specific term for that I would like for you to know. But for right now, just know that, if you engage in deviance, that you could in fact be labeled a deviant. And this is just a person who does not conform to established social norms. And because norms can take on a variety of definitions, right? There are different types of norms, folkways, mores, laws, taboos. Then how significant it is that you're being labeled a deviant might have a little bit to do with, what type of norms are you breaking. Like if you're breaking a taboo, you're a cannibal, then being labeled a deviant in that way might come with much stronger consequences and repercussions than if you are labeled a deviant for, I don't know, being a man who wears eyeshadow, which is you just breaking a folkway, the informal norm that men don't wear obvious makeup. But all of that, of course, is presuming that you get labeled a deviant in the first place. And this brings up the concepts of primary and secondary deviance, because almost all of us engage in some acts or possess some attributes that others would potentially see as being deviant, and this is called primary deviance, right? We litter, we speed, we cheat on our spouse, we do something that would be labeled as deviant. However, since most of us do not actually get defined as deviant, which is what secondary deviance is, that the act of getting defined as being a deviant, it raises the question about, who does and doesn't get caught. Deviance is like a tree falling in a forest. If no one hears it fall, does it really fall? Primary deviance, if no one witnesses you being a deviant, and you don't really get labeled, then does the deviance occur? If it does occur, does it really matter if no one is there to see it and label it? And then even if they see it, they still need to then in fact label you a deviant, right? So then it becomes, who do we see do something wrong and then we then judge and label them for it, versus maybe making excuses or questioning what we saw, or just, poo-pooing it and being like, oh, well, that's not a big deal for that particular person. And so just know that secondary deviance is not guaranteed. You are not necessarily going to experience secondary deviance in your lifetime, even though we know with almost certainty everyone engages in primary deviance. And of course, this is all made more kind of complicated because some things that we label as being deviant in our society only become deviant when you go too far, which raises the question, does someone even know when they are moving from something that is socially acceptable to socially problematic to socially deviant, which is where normally then that secondary deviance and that labeling takes place. And so, if you look at this chart, that is related to addictive behaviors that we label as being socially deviant, things like illegal drug use, alcoholism, excessive gambling, sexual abuse, exploitative sex, you'll see that a lot of those things have some underpinnings that are in fact socially acceptable. We are a society that promotes social drinking, occasional social drinking, drinking in the correct context, drinking establishments. Appropriate painkiller use is not seen as problematic. Your grandma playing bingo, participating in the state lottery, an occasional trip to Vegas, no one points as those things as being deviant. It's just at some point that they can become problematic. And then at that point, if they go even further, they can then become deviant, and a person risks being labeled a deviant. So what exactly happens, when you engage in this deviance? How do other people respond? This brings up the concept of social control. And these are the systematic practices developed by social groups to encourage conformity and discourage deviance. So basically, how does society encourage us to conform, and how does it discourage us from engaging in deviance? And so, if you can think of a few examples of this, this can include everything from, rewards for conforming to, punishments for being deviant. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those rewards and punishments look like in an upcoming slide. Now, I always have students that raise the question, can deviance be occasionally rewarded? And certainly, it can be. I think that's one of the interesting things about the rise of social media and Instagram influencers and YouTubers is there is this kind of wiggle room where sometimes in some segments of society, we give a little bit of prestige, status, public acclaim to people that do something deviant. Think about like those videos, those prank videos, right? If all of us went around, doing things, scaring people, pranking people on purpose, it would be really negative. But the fact that a couple people do this and then they film it and then they put it on, YouTube, and at least for some people, they think this is extremely funny and they share it and they watch it and it generates clicks and likes, which, can make these people, these prankster YouTubers, potentially very rich. So that's just one example of how sometimes deviance can be occasionally rewarded. Another way is like activists when they're at the forefront of a cause or an issue. So it hasn't caught on yet, but they risk things. They risk their livelihoods. They risk maybe even their lives. Even if it's not rewarded at that moment, perhaps it's rewarded. Looking back, and we're like, oh my gosh, that person was a martyr, that person stood up for what they believed in, that is really that was really brave, that was really remarkable. So there are some times where deviance is occasionally rewarded, but most of the time, if you are somewhere doing something deviant, you are going to experience some repercussions. And so that social control can take on two forms: formal social control and informal social control. Informal social control are the unofficial means of sanctioning deviance. People can, frown at you. They can give you dirty looks. They can make comments, both, out loud or under their breath. They could try to, embarrass you. All of those are ways in which everyday people can try to control other people's behavior. Formal social control is attempts to officially sanction certain behaviors and visibly punish others. And so in order for it to be formal social control, then the deviance you are engaging in must be related to like a specific law or regulation prohibiting the act. And normally that means that the punishment is also usually officially established, whether it's prison, fine, being fired, getting written up if it's in your place of employment or at school. But formal social control is related explicitly to usually formal norms and people having the authority to enforce those norms. So you want to think about authority figures having formal social control, but everybody else, everyday people, having informal social control. And part of the reason why the criminal justice system is kind of tacked onto the deviance chapter, of course, is because one formal norm, of course, are laws. And part of why we have laws is that we create them in response to a perceived need for formal social control. That in regards to these specific behaviors, we think it's important that your city, your state, the federal government have had the ability to regulate this behavior and to punish people if they don't uphold this behavior. And so, in this way, laws kind of reflect the changing standards of what is right and wrong, and they reflect the values of those people that are in positions of authority and power. And so, it doesn't mean that laws are necessarily stable. We can think of things that used to be the law that are no longer the law, of everything from it not being permissible to, marry outside of your race, it not being permissible for people to marry people of the same sex. Of course, slavery used to be permissible, segregation used to be permissible. You know, there was a time period, of course, during Prohibition where alcohol was not permissible. So laws can change, and sometimes we don't realize that laws are changing, of course, until they in fact do change. And we're going through a time period now where we're seeing some laws shift and change around things that either used to be permissible, like maybe corporal, or they used to be universally seen as okay, like corporal punishment, spanking. And now you have some states that are trying to kind of crack down on that. Or you see things that used to not be permissible, like marijuana, becoming increasingly more permissible by state and city. So all of this just reflects those values about what do the people in power feel like they need to exert formal social control over. And so that formal or informal social control, specifically the punishments and the rewards that are involved, are called sanctions. And so sanctions are the penalties and rewards for conduct concerning a social norm. And sanctions, when we use that word maybe in our day-to-day life, is almost always negative. But it's worth noting the sociological definition that sanctions can be a positive or a negative. So a positive sanction would be giving someone a raise for doing something right, or smiling at someone when you see them engaging in behavior that you approve of. And of course, negative sanctions can be everything from, frowns to fines to imprisonment to writing a ticket, right? All of those to ostracizing, someone, excluding them, gossiping about them. All of those are kind of examples of negative sanctions. And so that's it for this particular presentation. It was kind of long. Next one's going to be me explaining why deviance occurs according to different theorists.